Hello, regional and city planning students. My name is Dr. Sarah Little, and I'm an assistant professor in landscape architecture. Dr. Lowry thought that it would be a great idea if I introduced you to the research method behavior mapping. It might not be a good fit for the project that you're working on in class, but he thought that it would be good for you to be aware of behavior mapping as you enter the profession. The work that I'm going to present to you today is a result of a collaboration with Dr. Adina Cox at the University of Kentucky and Dr. Janet Loback at Cornell University. We have collaborated over several years collecting data at natural playgrounds. Now, this method can be used for any sort of built environment, not just playgrounds. But the examples that I present today will be nature playgrounds. Behavior mapping is an intensive field observation method that links behavior to the environment. And there's always two types of information you want to collect. The first is the behavior, and the second is the location of that behavior. So let's take a look at this observation data sheet. This is where you record the behavior. The columns represent the behaviors of interest, and in the rows you populate the behavior that you observed. This last column we always leave open so that we can write a description of the activity. This is just a way to help us validate our work and to make sure that the behavior that we captured is correct. On the base map, you want to mark the location of this observed behavior. So let's take a look here at this point that's labeled 6. So at this point here, we can go to our data sheet, find row 6, and this is the type of behavior that occurred at that location. Ultimately, this data is either collected directly into an ArcGIS program or is later imported into an ArcGIS program. And within ArcGIS, you can create graphic representations of this relationship between the design of the physical environment and behavior. There are two types of behavior mapping. The first one is place-centered. In place-centered behavior mapping, you're purely interested in how the design of the physical environment supports behavior. So this map here was created by my colleague, Dr. Janet Loback. This was a project she was involved in. It was the renovation of a schoolyard. So within this map, she is documenting the location of behaviors. Within this larger site, she has divided it into smaller observation zones and recorded the behavior within those smaller zones. These dots could be separate children. These dots could represent the same children. It doesn't matter in place-centered behavior mapping. All you're trying to do is document the behavior regardless of who's doing it at the location at which the behavior occurs. In person-centered behavior mapping, it's all about the person, how the person, a specific individual, moves through the environment. So this example here is Family Circus cartoon, little Billy on the first day of summer vacation, and it documents how he moves through the environment on his first day of summer vacation. What's nice about person-centered behavior mapping is it does start to highlight that relationship between the design of the physical environment and behavior, but we get to understand the demographic influence over behavior as well. So we can look at gender, depending on what types of information we can collect from the individual. Maybe we can start to look at socioeconomic status, how that affects behavior, family income, mother's education level, and really start to understand how these other influences factor into this environment and behavior relationship. Oh, one thing before I move from that slide, one thing to consider is that if you're going through IRB review, in place-centered behavior mapping, that is typically exempt from IRB review, whereas person-centered would have to undergo a full review. When you're thinking of using behavior mapping, there are 3 considerations. The first is, what types of behaviors do you want to document? How will you record the observational data and locational data? And then establishing protocols to ensure that research is systematic and repeatable. This is a list of behaviors that Dr. Cox, Dr. Loback, and I have used over the years. The two that I want to draw your attention to is a scale determining play type. This is the play observation scale developed by Rubin. We'll talk about this later. And then CARS. This stands for Children's Activity Rating Scale. This assesses children's physical activity level on a scale of 1 to 5, and we'll also talk about that later. When you're recording data, there are three main ways to do that. One is a paper-based method, where you use a paper-based map and a paper data sheet. The data that you collect on paper will then have to be entered into an ArcGIS program. You could use a hybrid method that combines paper and digital methods. So a very common hybrid model would be a paper-based map and then using a database app downloaded on a smartphone. So again, you'll have to manually enter data into ArcGIS. Lastly, you can do a full digital method, and this is what we're going to be interested in looking at in the exercise that we're going to do together. So best case scenario is you can collect the data directly into an ArcGIS program. You'll have a tablet, you can even collect it on your smartphone, but you just want to make sure that the way that you're collecting data is compatible with a GIS system. So again, if you can collect it directly into an ArcGIS product, that would be best. While a fully digital method is going to be more expensive than a paper or hybrid model, you have less chance for error to be introduced into your data set because you're entering the data directly into ArcGIS. With paper and hybrid models, you have to manually enter the data, and this introduces the opportunity for error in your data set. Protocols, I'm not going to talk too much about this because Dr. Cox, Dr. Loback, and I wrote a really nice article in 2018 about it, and it very clearly explains how to establish protocol. But one thing you want to understand within protocol is establishing these observation zones, and so these could be related to Roger Barker's behavior settings. But basically within this larger site, you want to subdivide it into observation zones, and these are smaller areas that you can easily observe. You'll want to establish how you rotate through these zones, and you also want to establish how you're going to scan these zones and document the behavior. So this is a project that we did in 2016, and we collected data for a week at the Cincinnati Nature Center at their nature playscape. And of course, during that week, Ohio was experiencing a heat wave. So that definitely affected usage. It was really hot. We did have a lot of observations, but definitely the weather affected the number of observations we were able to collect. That's just a nature of the beast, right? When you're collecting data outdoors, you're always at the mercy of weather. Here's a map of the site. The primary pathway is shaded in this pink color. The site was completely fenced, and it had one entrance that also served at the exit. You can see this really nice rustic arbor that marked the entrance. And then there were three main activity areas on the site. The first one here is this mud kitchen. And clustered around the center, you have these workstations, you had a water faucet, you had loose pots and pans, spoons, and dirt, of course, to make mud. In the center, you had a creek, and this was also a main area of activity. So it was this beautiful man-made creek that spilled along these little waterfalls contained by these big boulders, and you would have some fallen logs across the creek. And then lastly, there is a build zone area. The Nature Center provided these permanent armatures. You can see a picture of them here. This was a cabin foundation. And kids would use these armatures to prop branches against to create forts. And there was a variety of material provided. So you had larger branches that were heavier. You even had big stumps that kids would roll. And then you had smaller twigs and smaller branches. So it accommodated a range of physical upper body strength. When we look at who was there on the weekend and weekdays, Over 2 days, of course, there was more people there than during the week. We had a large number of boys that we observed during the week, on the weekend, but during the weekday, the numbers between boys and girls were pretty similar. And then on both the weekend and the weekdays, we observed more women than men. This is an example of a heat map, and this is one of the spatial statistical analysis that you can do in ArcGIS. So here we see that areas in red, that represents a high concentration of children, and then areas of light green, lower concentration, and then the white areas we didn't observe any children in. So again, here are the three main areas: the mud kitchen, the creek, and the build zone. The adults also tended to cluster in these three main areas: the mud kitchen, the creek, and the build zone. But then we had the addition of this entry area, particularly this area right here. And this is a pavilion, a shaded pavilion with benches. So we saw a lot of adults preferring to sit, preferring to be where benches were and where there was shade. So let's compare the two maps. So this is the children's heat map, right? So let's look at the mud kitchen. So this is the children, and we can see the children are clustered around these three areas right here. And these were the water spigot, these were the workbenches, this was the heart of the activity in the mud kitchen. Then if we compare it to the adults, we see the adults are on the periphery. Again, these are benches. This was a shaded area. So adults on the periphery, around the benches, in the shade. Let's look at the creek. So we see a high concentration of children in this area. This is a pathway that crosses the creek. But we see a lot of children here in this area too, and this was a log that went over the center of the creek. When we compare it to the adults, again, we see adults concentrated in the same areas, this shallow area, and then this log bridge over the creek. But then we see this area. We see a lot of adults here. This, again, benches and shade cells. All right, so let's look at the build zone. So we see the children are clustered around these armatures, and the adults here are clustered around the periphery of these armatures. All right, so what we see is that these features that are provided for children to facilitate the activity are being used. So the spigot in the mud kitchen, the work counter in the mud kitchen, those are being used. Shallow areas in the creek are being used. Logs traversing the creek are being used. And then these armatures within the build zone are being really used by the children. And then we see adults along the periphery, right? So particularly where there are benches provided, that tends to be really good for adults. But I was interested in looking more at the creek. So again, here's a picture of the shade cells with the benches, right? Here's that shallow area where the children tended to congregate. But I was really interested in what was happening here, right? Were the adults playing in the creek? What was going on? So one thing that we documented was environmental interaction. And there are 4 codes within environmental action: fixed natural, loose natural, fixed homemade, loose manufactured. And within the summary, right, we wrote the activity that we observed. So that's how we were able to collect this type of information. So in this particular area, fixed natural were boulders. Loose natural was the water in the creek. Fixed homemade were the log benches. And then loose manufactured were anything like tying shoes, giving kids food, any kind of custodial type of activity. We saw a lot of that happen here. But the majority of the behavior we observed in adults, they were engaged with fixed natural, or they were engaged with the boulders. So basically, they were using the boulders as benches while the children played in the water. So again, providing adults this opportunity to have seats. It doesn't have to be a formalized bench. It could be a boulder as long as it was high enough to serve as a seat. Okay, so I talked to you about CARS, the Children's Activity Rating Scale. It's on a scale of 1 to 5. And so what happens is we collapse the numbers together. So when we say CARS high, that's a high level of physical activity that represents 4 and 5. CARS moderate is 3, and CARS low is 1 to 2, right? So low physical activity, moderate, and then high. And so when we look at the three main areas on the site, we see that the Mud Kitchen supports a tremendous amount of low physical activity because most of it is dramatic play. When we're thinking about children who have limited physical ability, to be able to have a space that they can interact with other children and it not require a high level of physical activity, that is really significant. We see that the build zone supported a moderate level of physical activity, and a lot of this came in lifting, right? So providing those heavier elements, those bigger branches, those bigger stumps that kids roll, this promoted a moderate level of physical activity. And then in the creek, it was really evenly distributed between low, moderate, and high physical activity. When we're looking at the type of play type, we see that this was coming from the Rubin scale, the play observation scale. What's important to consider here is that they're listed in a hierarchy. So this functional play is a lower order play, and games with rules is a higher order play. So functional is basically very physical. Exploratory is it's physical, but there's a purpose, you're seeking something. Constructive is you're building something. Dramatic is using your imagination. And games with rules is where you create your own set of rules. The children agree upon those rules and then apply those rules to play. So the reason why this is a hierarchy, right, is as you move from functional to games with rules, the reliance on cognitive skills increases. So when we look at the creek, it supported a lot of physical or functional and exploratory activity. The build zone, of course, supported a lot of constructive play, but also it supported a lot of dramatic play. And here, the Mud Kitchen, we saw a lot of exploratory play and a lot of dramatic play. So the thing that's important to understand is this could be related, the reliance on cognitive skills, right? Cognitive skills is a product of maturation. So as children get older, their cognitive skills improve and they're able to engage in more kind of dramatic play and games with rules. So if you think about it in terms of ages, right, we see that potentially the creek could support younger children maybe better than the build zone. Because in the build zone, we saw a lot of constructive and dramatic play that would rely, particularly dramatic play that would rely on developed cognitive skills. And so maybe in the build zone, this would support older children, whereas the creek and the Mud Kitchen would support the activity of younger children. And this is important to consider too, particularly in the context of thinking about adults and using benches. So maybe along the creek, making sure the boulders can accommodate, can double as seating, making sure there are benches in the Mud Kitchen, but maybe in the build zone, right? If it's supporting older children, maybe reducing the number of benches in that area or seating opportunities would be great, since this could potentially support older children, and older children need to have more autonomy in the physical environment. So that is just a really brief rundown on behavior mapping. Next, we're going to talk about the technology that we're going to use for this exercise. In this exercise, we're going to be using the Collector app in order to collect observational data. The main point of this exercise is to test different types of hardware in collecting data in outdoor conditions. For the interest of time, I'm not going to get into a lot of details about how to create a map and access it through the Collector app. Instead, I'm going to refer you to this really excellent publication. It's called Using the Esri Collector app, a publisher's manual, and you can find it at this web address. It is very clear and easy to use. It gives you very clear step-by-step guidelines on how to collect data using the Collector app. So I would highly recommend reviewing this manual if you're interested in collecting data this way. The screen that we're looking at is a Samsung S4 tablet, and that's one of the hardwares that we will be testing in this exercise. You may be looking at an iPad or looking at your smartphone, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm using a Samsung S4 tablet. So what you want to do is click on the Collector icon in order to open the Collector app. You'll need an enterprise account in order to access maps through Collector. You can get an enterprise account by contacting the GIS administrator here on campus. But for the purpose of this exercise, we'll just use my enterprise account. And here, when you see on the screen, it says all maps. These are all the maps that I have created in ArcGIS Online. The one that we'll be interested in using is hardware_RCPL. So what you want to do is click on download. Here where you have to choose a base map, choose imagery. And what will pop up is the aerial photograph, and you want to choose your work area. We'll be looking at behavior in the South Oval. So we want to zoom out a little bit, center this. We want to make sure we get all of the South Oval in this blue square. And then click download. And that will download this map onto your device. The reason you want to do that is in case you're outside and you don't have Wi-Fi connection, then you'll still be able to collect the data locally on your device, and then you'll just have to sync the map up to your ArcGIS Online account. All right, so that has downloaded. If you look in the upper left-hand corner under Collector, you see this arrow for a drop-down menu. Click on Device, and that'll take you to the base map that we just loaded. So let's click on hardware_RCPL. Anytime you're prompted to improve your location, always hit skip. What we see is the aerial photograph of the South Oval, and we see a dialog window that says Collect New, and it has a feature class labeled Hardware. You can zoom in and out on the map using your middle finger and index finger. Touch the screen, spread your fingers apart to zoom in, spread your fingers together to zoom out. So let's zoom into this sidewalk here, just above this fountain that's right outside of Gould Hall. So you'll want to click on your feature class Hardware. Again, improve my location, always hit skip. And what you'll see are the different domains that we'll be entering information into. If you look here at Hardware, underneath it, it says missing location. So let's add the location. Let's say that we saw a woman walking here. So this feature class, the type of geometry it uses is point. So whenever you touch the map, it adds this point, and the data that we're getting ready to fill in will always be associated with this point. All right, let's go to our domains, click on Event, and what happens is you have a keyboard that pops up. If you press the equal sign at the bottom of the keyboard, you can move the keyboard around. I tend to keep the keyboard stationed in the bottom left-hand corner. It seems to be out of the way there. The event is the sequential number of the observation. So since this is the first observation that we're making, we'll enter 1. click on no value under gender, and you have a menu that pops up. The first choice you'll see is female, male, and then unknown. I like to put unknown in gender, especially when I'm observing children. Sometimes with infants and toddlers, it's really difficult to tell the gender of the child unless the child is completely decked out in blue or pink. So I always like to keep that unknown in there. But as I said earlier, it was a woman walking. All right, next we're going to enter in information about age. So click on no value under age, and you'll see this menu pop up. Age sometimes is really difficult to observe, and so I like to employ large age ranges. That makes it a little bit easier. So the first range is less than 18 years old. So this would be children and adolescents. The next is 18 to 30. So theoretically, this would be college students. The next is 30 to 50. Again, this could be college students, maybe even faculty staff. And then the last would be 55 plus or senior citizens. And again, this could be students, faculty, or staff. But let's say it was a woman in her 20s that we saw. Group size, again, click on no value. If she were walking alone, we would check alone. If she was walking with one other, it'd be group of 2, 2 other, group of 3, and so on. So let's say she was walking alone. Activity, click on no value. The menu that pops up has a list of potential activities you could observe at the South Oval. So the first one is standing, sitting. The next one is walking, jogging, or running. So this would be for the purposes of going to a destination and not necessarily engaging in this activity for exercise. The next category talks about non-motorized vehicles, so skateboards, bikes, scooters. The next one looks at motorized vehicles. So whether it's a service truck or a golf cart, because this is OU and there's always a golf cart somewhere on campus, or one of those electric scooters like the Birds or the Limes that you see all over town. The last category is leisure or recreation. So if someone was jogging or running or walking for exercise, then you would want to check leisure recreation. Someone was walking a dog, throwing a frisbee. All of these would be classified as leisure recreation. And then there's other. I mean, it's hard to anticipate all the behavior that you could see on the South Oval, so leaving this other category is nice. If you do check other, though, it's really important to explain what that other activity is in the summary. So let's select leisure recreation. And in the summary, so if you'll hover your stylus over summary, you'll see that blue dot with the T. So click on that blue dot, and what comes up is a window that you can handwrite information, and it'll translate it into typed text. So let's say it was a woman. Let's say she was walking a dog. Let's say she was looking at her phone. Okay. And so we see that information. So when we're done, we want to, in the upper left-hand corner with the check mark that says done, we want to hit that. And so if you go back and click on hardware, you'll see what we just filled out. Okay, so let's close that details window. So let's say our next observation is in this fountain. So again, we want to click hardware. You want to skip this. Missing location, let's say that the person was here. Okay, so event would be number 2. Let's say the person that we observed was a male. Let's say that didn't quite look like a college student, but wasn't a senior citizen. Let's put the male in the 30 to 55 years old. Let's say he was with someone, maybe another man. Activity. let's say they were sitting on the benches there looking at the fountain. So again, to enter summary, you want to hover your stylus over the screen, tap in that blue dot. The handwriting dialog box comes up. Just hit backspace to delete no value. And you want to say 2 older men sitting on bench looking at fountain and talking. Isn't that handy? Okay, so again, when we're done, you want to hit the check mark in the upper left hand corner, done. And you can see the features here. If you just hit the arrow or the X, it'll close out that window, and then we're ready to record another observation. So again, very quickly, wherever you see the location, you want to open your feature class, skip, click where you observe the person, and then populate the information. So I'll quickly do this. I'll just say text, hit done. Okay, at the end of the observation, you always want to hit this X at features to close that out. Open up the feature class again, skip, and then mark the location of the next observation. Okay, what's important with this exercise is not necessarily the reliability of the data that you're collecting or that you follow some sort of strict protocol. It's just a way to test this hardware in an outdoor environment. So I'm not necessarily concerned with the quality of the data you're collecting. I just want you to use the collector app, go through the process of collecting the data, and really use that process to evaluate the hardware in outdoor conditions.